Recently, I've attended a range of Salesforce events where the conversation inevitably turned towards the latest announcements coming out of Salesforce. Agentforce featured heavily, as did Headless360, and the wider vision Salesforce continues to promote around artificial intelligence, automation, and the future of enterprise software. What struck me was not the technology itself, it was the reaction to it. There was certainly interest in the room, but there was very little excitement. The discussion felt noticeably different from the conversations that often followed major sales announcements a decade ago. Back then, organizations could immediately see how a new feature or capability might solve a problem they were actively facing. This time, the mood felt more subdued. While people acknowledged the potential of AI-powered agents and headless experiences, there was also a sense that many of these ideas existed in a future that had not yet arrived for the average organization. During one of these events, I found myself in a surprisingly animated discussion with the developer. We were debating Headless 360 and Salesforce's broader ambition to move beyond traditional interfaces towards a world where users increasingly interact through conversational experiences, intelligent agents, and automated workflows. His position was clear and entirely logical. This is simply where technology is heading. Whether organizations are ready for it or not is largely irrelevant, because eventually this will become the standard way people interact with enterprise systems. I understood his argument, and in many respects, I agree with it. Technology rarely waits for organizations to feel comfortable before moving forward. History is full of examples where new ways of working initially felt unfamiliar before eventually becoming commonplace. What fascinated me, however, was not the conclusion itself. It was the fact that we're approaching the same subject from entirely different perspectives. He was viewing the future through the lens of technology. I was viewing it through the lens of people. The more I reflect on that conversation afterwards, the more I realized that this difference in perspective may explain many of the challenges organizations experience, not only with Salesforce, but with enterprise software in general. For decades, enterprise systems have been designed primarily around how organizations think. Increasingly, I believe the question businesses should be asking is what would happen if we designed them around how humans think instead. That distinction may sound subtle, but it has profound implications. Most enterprise software is built around structures, processes, and data models. And that's entirely understandable. Organizations need consistency. They need governance. They need reporting. They need data. As a result, systems are naturally organized around objects, records, workflows, and relationships between information. From a technical perspective, this approach makes perfect sense. Human beings, however, do not think this way. A salesperson doesn't wake up in the morning thinking about opportunities, accounts, and activities. A service advisor doesn't arrive at work thinking about cases, contacts, and entitlement processes. A manager does not start the day considering dashboards, reports, and record hierarchies. People think in terms of outcomes. They think about customer meetings they need to prepare for. They think about problems they need to solve. They think about conversations they need to have, decisions they need to make, and objectives they need to achieve. Their mental model is fundamentally different from the model around which most enterprise software is constructed. Now, this may sound like an academic observation, but it is something I encountered constantly through my work as a trainer. One of the principles that underpins most every successful training program I have delivered is what we often describe as a day in the life of approach. Rather than teaching Salesforce through objects, functionality, and system features, we teach it through the reality of the user's working day. If I train a sales rep, I do not begin by explaining the opportunity object. I begin by asking what happens when they log in on a Monday morning. What information are they looking for first? Which customers require attention? What meetings are going to take place? What actions need to happen before they leave for their first appointment? Similarly, when training managers, we do not start by exploring reporting functionality. We start by discussing the decisions they need to make. What information do they require to coach their teams? How do they identify risks within the pipeline? What signal indicates that intervention may be required? The distinction is important because people learn most effectively when technology is connected to context. They do not learn systems in isolation. They learn systems through relevance. This observation raises an interesting question. If training works best when organized around the user's day, why are so many systems organized around the underlying technology? Now, the answer, I suspect, lies in the fact that technical professionals and end users often experience the world through different lenses. Most developers, architects, and technical consultants have spent years learning how systems work. Their expertise lies in understanding data structures, integrations, workflows, logic, and technical architecture. These are valuable skills, and modern organizations could not function without them. However, many of the people designing enterprise systems have never performed the jobs those systems are intended to support. They haven't managed a sales territory. They've never spent a day handling customer complaints. They've never worked as a field engineer managing multiple service visits under time pressure. They've never been responsible for onboarding students at university or managing a business admin cycle. Again, this is not a criticism. It's simply a reflection of different professional experiences. The consequence, however, is that technical professionals naturally think in terms of systems, while end users think in terms of work. A developer sees an object model. A salesperson sees a customer conversation. An architect sees a workflow. A service advisor sees a customer problem that needs resolving before the end of the day. Both perspectives are valid, but they are not the same. The challenge arises when one perspective dominates the design process. This is where the thought experiment becomes particularly interesting. Imagine for a moment that Salesforce had been designed by people like trainers, behavioral psychologists, and frontline workers rather than technical professionals. Imagine that every design decision was evaluated not against technical elegance, but against a single important question. Does it make the user's day easier? The resulting platform would almost certainly look very different. Rather than presenting users with a collection of objects, records, and navigation menus, the system would likely be organized around journeys and outcomes. The starting point would not be the data structure. The starting point would be the person's role and the activities they are trying to complete. A salesperson logging in might be greeted with a workspace centered entirely around the flow of their day. Upcoming meetings, customers requiring attention, opportunities at risk, and actions needing completion would form the primary experience. The users wouldn't need to think about which object contains the information they require. They would simply focus on what needs to happen next. A customer service advisor might see a completely different experience. Their environment would revolve around customer issues, response commitments, escalations, and service priorities. Information would surface according to the relevance rather than according to where it happens to reside within the system. Managers would experience yet another perspective. Their focus would naturally center on coaching opportunities, performance indicators, emerging risks, and decisions requiring attention. The system would be organized around leadership activities rather than around data structures. In essence, the platform would adapt itself to the way people actually work, rather than expecting people to adapt themselves to the way the platform works. Now, this may sound remarkably similar to some of the ambitions Salesforce is pursuing through things like Agentforce and Headless360. In many respects, it is and it will be. The irony is that I believe Salesforce may ultimately be moving towards exactly the right destination. The challenge is that many organizations have not yet addressed the underlying problems that make that destination valuable. Headless360 assumes that users want to engage with outcomes rather than systems. I believe that assumption is largely correct. The problem is that most organizations have not yet spent sufficient time understanding what those outcomes actually are. Many Salesforce projects still begin with discussions about objects, fields, permissions, workflow, and reporting requirements. Relatively few begin with a detailed exploration of how a user's day unfolds. Requirements workshops frequently focus on what information needs to be captured rather than why the work itself is performed. As a result, organizations often create systems that are technically impressive, but operationally disconnected from reality. This is one of the reasons trainers frequently identify challenges that project teams miss. Trainers spend their time observing behavior. We watch users navigate systems. We see moments of hesitation. We hear frustration. We witness confusion. We understand where confidence drops and where workarounds emerge. Most importantly, We develop an appreciation for the difference between what appears logical on a process diagram and what feels intuitive during a busy working day. The more complex organizations become, the more valuable this perspective becomes. AI will undoubtedly continue to reshape enterprise software. Conversational interfaces will become increasingly sophisticated. Automation will remove many routine tasks. Headless experience may eventually become commonplace. None of these developments are inherently problematic. The real question is whether organization understands the humans these technologies are intended to serve. Too often, transformation programs focus on changing systems while paying insufficient attention to understanding work itself. The assumption is that if the technology is good enough, people will eventually adapt. Experience suggests the opposite is often true. The organization that achieves the greatest success with Salesforce are rarely those with the most sophisticated technology. They're usually the organizations that possess the clearest understanding of their users. They know how people work. They understand the pressure that people face. They recognize where friction occurs. They appreciate that technology succeeds when it completes human behavior rather than attempting to replace it. This is why I believe every Salesforce project should involve far more observation than it currently does. Developers should spend time shadowing users. Architects should observe operational teams. Admins should experience the environments they are supporting. Trainers should be involved much earlier in design discussions, not because technical expertise is insufficient, but because technical expertise alone cannot fully explain human behavior. Empathy is not a substitute for good design. It's a prerequisite for it. Perhaps that was the real lesson from the discussions at these events. The developer and I were not actually debating the future of technology. We were debating where organizations should focus their attention today. He was focused on where Salesforce is going. I was focused on whether businesses truly understand the people they are taking with them. Both conversations matter. However, if organizations fail to understand the second question, the first becomes significantly harder to achieve. The future of Salesforce may well be headless. It may be conversational. It may be powered by autonomous agents that handle large parts of our daily work. But before any of that becomes meaningful, organizations must solve a far more fundamental challenge. They must understand the difference between how systems think and how humans think. Only then can they begin designing experience that genuinely places people first. And if they do that successfully, they may discover that the future Salesforce is describing feels considerably closer than it appears today.